Good afternoon. It seems like evening soon in Gauteng, and welcome to another edition of Fin24 Speaks. My name is Ron Derby, editor of Fin24. Today we are joined by independent economist Thabi Leoka, Sifiso Skenjana, chief economist at IQ Business, to talk about what's been commonly termed as the emergency budget that we've just seen from the finance minister, Tito Mboweni. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. Thanks for coming on. Thabi, I want to start with you. I'll start with you. Your thoughts on the budget, the adjustment to the budget anyway, and any surprises there for you?
I was thoroughly underwhelmed. The minister throughout the year has been talking about, or throughout the pandemic rather, has been talking about war. And so has the president, that we are at war and we need to bring out all the ammunition that we have to fight this war. And what I can say is that I wouldn't want to go into war with Minister Tito Mboweni and his treasury team, because they wouldn't bring the ammunition that is required to actually kill the enemy. And so, having said that, I think that I was gobsmacked actually. I thought that there would be a lot in terms of reform. I knew that the figures would be bad, and I felt that what he did was tell us what we knew, but not give us solutions as to how the government plans on dealing with these solutions. So I am sitting here after the supplementary budget, still wondering, like I did yesterday and the day before, how we're going to get ourselves out of this economic rut.
Yes, so war. I would agree with Thabi that not very inspiring with regards to just that the war, the economic war, that is the economic response to the pandemic. Your views on what we heard this afternoon?
I mean, I think I absolutely agree. And, he spoke about the Herculean task and of closing the hippo's mouth, but, without getting into the detail of the things that would be required to shift for that mouth to actually close, right? So if you heard, his utterance around, wishing, Mr. Mkhunu luck in dealing with the bloated, public sector wage issue. Again, that it really doesn't, inspire a lot of confidence around, real tangible measures to make sure that number starts to trickle down. Over and above that, we know that the economy in the South African context has lost productive capacity over the last 20 years. And so if you talk numbers of debt to GDP, there's GDP in that formula. And so what does it mean for us to build capacity into the economy so that, that fraction starts to look a little bit smaller? When you hear that you expect your revenue shortfall to be 300 billion, or within the medium-term framework, yet your infrastructure planning is 100 billion over a 10-year period, you're starting to understand that a lot of the things the value, the multiply, value that you might get from infrastructure spend just won't cut it in terms of, enabling the economy to get back onto a sustainable growth path.
Yeah, Thabi, with regards to that speech, growth, channeling growth in the economy. The only thing I heard about that is that 100 billion rand infrastructure, but nothing really inspiring any sense of confidence, okay, that this is how we're going to get the South African economy moving forward.
Yeah, he spoke about the sovereign debt crisis, which is another where there's a contradiction. We spoke about the sovereign debt crisis, and typically sovereign debt crisis leads to a default, because then investors start pulling out their money and there's a default. But at the same time, we have to spend money because to get ourselves out of this situation we're in, and also to support the economy. So again, how are you going to, you flagged this crisis, we're flirting with default. With defaulting and sovereign debt crisis. And at the same time, you haven't provided a solution, but you're actually doing exactly what will lead us to the sovereign debt crisis that you're flagging. So again, I'm not sure where we are going. In terms of also, I feel like they're dancing around the elephant in the room, even when I was listening to the press conference. There are solutions. We do have sufficient funds within the system to actually not only reallocate, but tap into. So within the system, there are departments currently that are not working optimally, only because this crisis is predominantly a health crisis that has moved to an economic crisis, and there's certain departments that are not central, and you can cut from that, and they have cut a little bit, but not enough. The other thing is that, yes, he's tapped into the multilateral funds, and we know that the NDB has a $1 billion loan, given us $1 billion loan. But again, the details of that, even in the press conference, he didn't really want to get into. He didn't want to get into the IMF. And this is how I would have positioned it. I would have mentioned all of this, all these loans. I would have mentioned the interest rates that we are going to pay on these loans. I would have mentioned how we're going to allocate these funds to start helping stimulate the economy. So basically, borrow to grow, and also help us recover from this pandemic economically. And I just didn't get that. So we are borrowing, and it's not good to borrow, but at the same time, it's not, the allocation is not right. Whereas actually you can, this is COVID funding. So what you can do is actually take that, all the resources that you can get, because actually the interest rates on the IMF funding and also NDB funding is far more easier to pay back than issuing bonds that we issue debt every week. And also, typically every year we issue a Eurobond. So the payment of that is higher than actually getting money from the NDB or the IMF. So word it like that, and then say, look, this is where we're going to put it. This 29 billion rands that was allocated towards health, remove it completely and allocate it elsewhere. Take all the COVID funding, because it has this attractive interest rate, put it into health and anything associated, because COVID is not just health. It's also social, it gives you, I know the NDB one especially, and the IMF one, goes into social activities and helping in terms of the impact of COVID on society, unemployment, etc. So they could actually have channeled all their borrowed money there, which is actually what is sapping money from the Fiscals currently, and taken the 229 billion that we've already allocated to health and put it elsewhere in the budget. But again, I didn't see that. And when I mean elsewhere, I don't mean throw it into public works, for instance. Put it into infrastructure investment or anything that will generate economic growth.
So you never want to be afraid of debt if used well. Just your views on what Thabi's saying, when the real allocation of funds to departments, away from departments that actually are just kind of frills that we have in the South African cabinet. Your thoughts on just that energy with regards to what we do in the situation?
No, I mean, I think the point that Thabi makes is an important one, and I think it's around walking, the South African citizens around your thought process, around a lot of the decisions that you make, and that, as I have famously said, that not all debt is bad debt, and we can borrow ourselves into growth depending on how we allocate those funds. And when we look at, for example, one of the positives that I took out of the speech, for example, is the energy towards not removing their foot on social spending. And we know that particularly in times of crises, inequality tends to exacerbate, and a lot more of the marginalized people in the context of the economy get more marginalized. And one of the interesting pieces of information I was reading not so long ago was that between active and non-active or discouraged job seekers, when you look at the discouraged job seekers, they tend to be also associated with poorer households and households with poorer access to basic services. And so, when you're looking at the number now, 3 million of those people, particularly being young people, those are certainly important contributions around what does it mean for us to build social resilience through a spending program, particularly social spending in the context of the economy. And those are all the things that contribute to improving your human capital index. And that should be one of the biggest investments that we make. but you've got to walk the citizens in your thinking around what, the choices that you make when you say that you're going to continue, giving money to local municipality for particular reasons. And I think that's one of the things. But I think over and above that, we heard that Deputy Minister Dr. David Masondo, will be spearheading the acceleration of the economic strategy that was tabled last year, October. But again, right, it's still not, for, giving us any faith around the expediency that is required, I think, to build capacity in the South African economy. One of the things that I keep talking around is the fact that if, as of the December tax statistics numbers, about 380 companies, right, out of 814,000 companies that were assessed for tax, only 380 of them contributed to 57% of our tax collection. And that means that we've got a high concentration challenge, industry concentration challenge in South Africa, where one big corporate fails, it's got material implications for our ability to collect tax, as well as its implications on unemployment. And therefore, how do we look at creating a broad-based participation for medium-sized businesses in the economy? How do you use your procurement processes that doesn't require you to release any money to ensure that people can participate in larger portions of the supply chains that they already operate in? These are some of the things that ought to come out from these budget conversations, where it really shows that we understand the scale of the issue, and we're going to use all the levers available to us, incentives and all of the other things that will inform a conducive environment for crowding in investment into the economy as well.
Now, Thabi, going to these budget changes that were announced today, it really about, I guess he said two things. We'll come back to the economic response. We are, I think all three of us here, underwhelmed by what we heard to a large extent. But it was about firstly, I guess the most important thing now is the health response. I mean, to a peak that we have not reached as yet. It's August.
So sorry, I didn't.
Towards that peak, do you think we are? I mean, the whole budget change is about two things, right? The health response and the economic crisis. So we are all underwhelmed, as I said, about the economic response now, and we'll come back to that in this conversation. But the health response, heading towards the peak in August, September, do you think we are as prepared as we could possibly be when it comes to COVID-19 and the peak that's to come?
Yeah, so I think to start off with, the pandemic has put health as an important sector in every economy. And I think prior to the pandemic, we all focus, especially in South Africa and many African countries, education was our primary worry. And now with this pandemic, it has made me realize that we need to prioritize health, and we need a universal healthcare system. Had you asked me last year if I support universal healthcare system, I would have said no. And like many South Africans, I would have doubted, and I still doubt, government's execution in terms of ensuring that all the funds are allocated efficiently. The other problem is we do have public hospitals which are badly run by the very government that is supposed to be rolling out this universal healthcare. But the pandemic has made me realize that someone who's sitting many kilometers away from me in a rural area, if they are sick and they have a disease and that disease is contagious, it does impact me sitting in, an economic hub in South Africa, Johannesburg. And so I can't go around thinking that that person's health and that person's disease and virus will not impact me, because what COVID-19 has taught us is that a virus can actually topple an economy. So I think looking back, we haven't allocated sufficiently towards health. And it also has unearthed a lot of problems, not only in the economy, but also in the health sector, where we are now learning about how many people die of diabetes and TBs, diseases that many people elsewhere in other countries don't die of because there's adequate resources towards those ailments. So I think that to start with, we haven't been allocating enough resources there. We've added, I think it was 21.5 billion towards healthcare. Do I think it's enough? I don't think it's enough, only because we are seeing a lot more people impacted and affected and infected, and affected in terms of obviously the economic, being unable to perform economically because a lot of people are retrenched or they are sick and they can't work. The other thing is that I also think this is not just, COVID is one of the ailments. We obviously haven't put enough resources in other of the diseases, environments that and viruses that are impacting the country. So to answer your question directly, I don't think that the 21.5 billion that's been allocated towards health is enough. I think that we need more. I also think that I'm worried about the NHI. I think that it is crucial now that we've seen the impact of a pandemic, and I think that had we had an NHI, we wouldn't have certain people in the country that are excluded from getting primary or good health care, as we're seeing in other countries that have better health care seem to be faring well in terms of dealing with this pandemic. The other thing is that we need funding for national health insurance. And as we're looking at this, none of this has accommodated the NHI. And it's quite clear that we need to have universal health care. Where is the funding going to come from? And I'm not seeing any allocation to national health care in this supplementary or even in the February budget. And I think that I worry that if we do introduce it, which we need to, it's going to shoot up the debt profile from debt to GDP or even our deficit. Already our deficit projections are horrifying. The fact that our debt to GDP is now around over 80% is what used to numbers that you see in Europe after the financial crisis. So it's just very worrying. Not enough money, but I don't know where we're going to get money to ensure that should anything happen like this, how are we going to deal with it?
So, with regards to, today with regards to the health sector and I guess NHI and universal healthcare, Thabi raises some interesting questions about just how we go in the future of funding healthcare in this country.
I think there are two interesting points about that particular question, and I would probably advocate for universal basic income first before I advocate for an NHI. And that's premised on, I think, the empirics that we've followed in terms of the existence of a UBI has resulted in better nutritional outcomes, better health outcomes, as well as better educational outcomes. And when we understand I think the constraints to the social development in South Africa, it is multidimensional. And so if you want to talk around, I'll make the example around education attainment, right? The number of things that are constraints and they live themselves out very differently in different provinces. Eastern Cape is very rural, and therefore schools don't get to the right capacity, and that's why you'll have one teacher teaching 5 subjects. Whereas in the Western Cape, for example, crime is more pervasive as an issue, as an impediment for people going to libraries, going to schools. And so dealing with the social challenges that ultimately reduce, I think, our social developmental metrics, that ultimately inform our social resilience, and health is one of those. And I think that's why I was saying that the existence of the UBIs enables people to discriminate sufficiently well on their expenditure patterns based on their primary need at that point in time. And so I'd certainly think that a UBI would be more comprehensive as a policy response. And it's not an and or an or. I think it's more around prioritization on if you had limited resources, where would you start? And I think also, pertaining to the structure of our economy and the virus itself, we understand from the research that we're hearing that older people are more susceptible to falling fatally ill from the virus. And when you look at unemployment numbers in South Africa, across all qualification levels, younger people have got higher rates of unemployment. And what this means is that as we approach the peak more breadwinners in the economy are most likely going to fall fatally ill. And the impact then that will have on household expenditure and household incomes and social resilience, I think metrics in the context of the economy are certainly going to be worse than what we think it will be. And I think that's why it's certainly for me, while we've piloted the 350 as it is a discriminatory grant, and so it's not universal, but we certainly should look at ways in which we extend that and explore that as something that becomes a permanent feature in the South African economy.
You said it's coming to an end in October already, right? That additional, yeah? That's quite the challenge that he set up for himself and I guess the country, politically in particular. No, I mean, for so long, I mean, Mboweni has been on this austerity path, right? Since he came in, he was just there to like, look, cut spending, cut expenditure, and ensure that we don't get downgraded by Moody's. Unfortunately, that has come to pass in March. Here he had to talk about growth. Do you think it's almost something that he almost has to rejig the entire department and it's thinking? It seems like they're kind of still stuck in that. It's hard to like shift away from that and almost deal with the crisis at hand, Thabi. Is that almost the reason why there was this lack of energy from Treasury with regards to the response? As you open up perfectly there, talking about the war that we're supposedly waging. You know,
you are right in that even his tone and delivery in the speech, I found that it was a little lackluster. But, you know, there's so many options. And one of the options that I actually suggested, I sat on the Presidential Economic Council, and one of the suggestions I suggested and also wrote in my article in the Fin24 is that there are departments that you can scale down and even downgrade. So you can downgrade something like public services or public works and remove public enterprise and move all the entities that fall under public enterprises into their respective departments. For instance, Eskom back into energy. If we have an SAA, it should go to transport. And then, so that's one thing. So you can look at the structure of government. And the composition of government is also not composed well. You can also downgrade. So there's certain departments that can be downgraded into agents and agencies of the state. For instance, public works doesn't need to be a whole government department with a minister, DG, etc. Public works can do exactly the same thing if it was an agency and had 50 people. That actually would be a lot more efficient. And you know, women, a minister of women, and you can, you know, there's several others where you can actually downgrade them, make them agencies, and you'd save money. And I don't think this will be politically easy to do, but this is something that I think will actually help even with efficiencies at dealing with the inefficiencies in government. The other suggestion that I would make is that, and I thought this is a no-brainer, the private sector is cutting either their job losses in the private sector or they are slashing wages. And those who are not shedding jobs are slashing wages, so that, and which makes sense economically, because I'd prefer a company to slash wages by 50% so that you can retain those workers, and when things normalize, you can increase to where they were before. And we've seen examples in the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, where Germany did exactly that, or it even had slots where certain workers would work in the early slot and then the others would work in the afternoon slot. And then if you compare it with what the US did, the US did a huge job losses as a result of the financial crisis. And what happened is that it impacted on the recovery and the speed at which both countries recovered. There's also skills that are lost. So there's a lot of research in terms of looking at the two, where in the US skills were lost as a result of job losses, and whereas in Germany skills were not lost because workers worked, but they just worked fewer hours and got a fewer salary. So back to South Africa, that the private sector is doing what it has to do and what it needs to do, which is great. The public sector, on the other hand, seems to be an untouchable. You can't shed jobs. You can't also reduce salaries. And the biggest part of the reason why we, even before the crisis, before the pandemic, part of the reason why we had this growing deficit is because of wages. The wage bill keeps ballooning. And what the finance minister tried to do in February, and I knew it was, would be very unsuccessful, was that he announced that they would cut the rate of growth in the wage bill to raise 160 billion rands. But obviously Labour didn't agree to it. And this time around, there was no discussion on that. So again, that is hanging somewhere. And government workers, some of whom actually are not working currently or not working as much as they should, only because the systems are not plugged in. Some of them are working from home. Some of them, they were diplomats in other countries and they had to come back to South Africa. So they're not actually even working, but they're still getting paid their full salary. It really doesn't make sense. And it again talks to the inefficiencies, the wrong composition of government, and also the priorities. We're still looking at a budget that is very much allocated towards consumption instead of investment or capital investment.
So speaking to that energy and that the lack of energy on matters regarding the wage bill, no movement there. Just your thoughts and response to what Thabi said.
I think, they find themselves in a very tricky corner because there's also local elections coming up next year. And so it's a politically tricky time for them to be doing mass layoffs. And I think the point that Thabi makes on following the lead from private sector around retaining people, but at least cutting salaries to ensure that at least the fiscus remains viable is certainly, I think, an important point, and we didn't hear, I think, nearly enough around that, and that's certainly, I think, again, a lot of probably quite a bit around the political posturing, particularly leading up to the local elections next year. I think also what was quite interesting for me was the lack of any conversation around SOEs, right? And we understand the cross exposures that government's got from a contingent liability point of view, largest at Eskom and SAA, etc. There's no conversation coming out of there besides the fact that we probably need to diversify our energy mix. But you saw during the COVID pandemic, right, is that a lot of the alternative energy providers are largely wind in South Africa. The force majeure conditions in their contract was exercised by Eskom, and therefore they weren't compelled to buy as much electricity from them. And that's got particular implications also because of the RPAs, and which is a guarantee on the purchase agreement. And so there's a whole lot of complexity around the fact that, one, the pandemic was certainly convenient for Eskom in its ability to accelerate its maintenance program. But I think it also speaks to what a transition into a more diversified energy mix is actually going to look like, and what the implications of that will be on our cross exposure, as I said, particularly from the contingent liabilities from an Eskom point of view. And I think that, again, is also going to be quite an interesting one to continue watching quite closely.
Yeah, man. I mean, our economic outlook referred to is most depressing for South Africa going the next couple of years. But looking at this biggest economic crisis in about over 90 years, as the minister said, but we're all leaning in on Treasury to do something about it. But Thabi, ministries such as DTI, small business, and others in that economic cluster, are they coming to the table with plans, or are they just sitting there like a deer in headlights? I just don't hear. My frustration there is that we don't hear enough from Patel or all the other ministries on just what are they going to do about the economy. There wasn't there a Ministry of Economic Planning for some time, for a term or two? The other ministries, right? We look at Treasury, but I guess that's the only one we can look at and say, do something. But there's more. There's your thoughts on these other very important ministries tied into the economy and just trying to get some ideas going.
I think, you know, you're making a very good point here, and it is a frustration to me, especially when it comes to the role of the Reserve Bank. And my argument with that is that we keep, when all else has failed, we turn to the one institution that is actually working well and say, look, why doesn't this Reserve Bank print money and save us all? And my question has always been, like my rebuttal to that has always been, but you know, there are all these other ministers that are supposed to actually deliver. The Reserve Bank cannot bring water. The Reserve Bank cannot bring sanitation and ensure that there's, you know, water and sanitation and electricity, etc. That is the job of various ministers. And so you're right in that the Treasury can only allocate. And how I look at it is, it has taken on several roles over the years, but it's a distributor of funds according to needs. And increasingly, obviously, the needs have been manipulated, and that's why the minister wants to adopt the zero-based budgeting process so that he can actually understand where the money goes to through a process where different ministers motivate for the expenditure. So I think one thing that the pandemic has unearthed, and one of the, you know, Minister Sisulu recently tweeted after receiving a message from someone who suddenly received water after 15 years. And she tweeted this message as a way of gloating to say, look, finally we've provided this water. And actually I thought, how embarrassing, because this water should have been provided. Why did we we didn't need a pandemic to provide services that were supposed to be provided for years ago, and actually that were budgeted for. And that's why we find ourselves here trying to grapple and get money from the Fiscal so that we can actually plug the holes that were created because of non-delivery that was supposed to have happened a long time, you know, years back. The fact that actually we're sitting here and there are schools that can't, where social distancing cannot happen because there were actually plans to extend the schools, but those schools were not extended for whatever reason, even though there was allocation within the budget to extend these schools. And now, because of social distancing, we can't fit all students into these schools because it's not possible to social distance. Same with water and sanitation. Realize that actually you can't now, if the kids go back to school, one of also the requirements for to keep within the health protocol is to have water and sanitation. And then many schools don't have water and sanitation. Then we have to rush to actually ensure that we get water and sanitation within this few weeks of a pandemic. So, you know, a couple of months within the that we've had this pandemic. So those are the issues that I think all along they weren't as frustrating, and maybe there's a position of privilege that I'm also displaying that it happened over there. But suddenly, when you're realizing that, hey, you know, again, these kids will infect communities, will infect, you know, provinces, will infect the country, and this is what we're actually seeing. And this is all because of the lack of service delivery over the years. So it is a problem, and I don't know how the National Treasury or the government will have to deal with this, but this is something that the president will have to deal with. He has to crack the whip from the top and ensure that his ministers actually deliver on this vision that he has for the country. You know, there's no point in having these major infrastructure visions like yesterday's symposium and these huge, you know, group plans where, and I think it was in a few years' time, we're going to see a surplus, and yet you're not dealing with the issue of wasteful spending and also, you know, the wrong composition of our budget, which then tends to be more around consumption rather than investment. So, you know, I think it's the president's prerogative to ensure that his ministers deliver on his vision, and it's also, and I know Sifiso mentioned that earlier, that mentioned elections. I think this is an excuse that we always have in South Africa, that there's an election. There's always, every 2 years, there's an election. And we shouldn't be doing things to appease people because of an election. We should actually be doing things because we have a long-term vision of the country. So if we are to cull, we are culling because we have a long-term vision. I think this short-termism is also costing us enormously, because it actually impedes on our ability to turn around the economy.
So, I mean, these other government departments and just how they actually interact with the Treasury, man, and just how they perform. Your view on them. I particularly pick on DTI and the Economic Planning Department, which is no longer existing. Yeah, carry on.
I mean, I think even on the elections issue, I think we probably shouldn't be having elections every 2 years. I think it's distracting for the economy, because we just can't plan for long enough, and we probably need to rethink that and maybe have local elections as well as national elections at the same time in the same year. But I'm sure there's some considerations that go into why that is and why that isn't. But it's something that I've historically held, that it is quite distracting that every 2 years we've got to go into politicking. But for me, there's certainly not enough of a positioning of how well we understand the problem that we're faced with, right? And so when we continuously hear some of the interventions that come in place, for example, I've made the example around textiles, right? And say, no, we need to revive the textiles industry. Well, do we understand what made it fail? Right? What made our textiles industry uncompetitive? And once we get into the bottom of that, we'll understand then that maybe we need to build the largest industrial park for all textile makers to come into that particular park, so that you can get economies of scale, so that we become price competitive. But that kind of thinking starts to get us closer into that we do understand the texture of the problem, so that our interventions are appropriate. And then that's what we tend to see in a lot of, I guess for me, the failures in the interventions that we see from various departments. Department of Small Business and Enterprise, for example, they'll talk around, funding for small businesses or funding for young entrepreneurs, being their primary consideration. But there's an entire, system of skills development, of mentorship, a whole lot of things that ensure business is sustainable. And so, are they showing an understanding of that texture, so that when they put in place interventions to start to enable, I think, a growth in entrepreneurship in the context of South Africa, that they're doing it correctly. And also, I think it's also understanding the economic enablers. So I am of the view, for example, that municipalities, as well as telecoms, electricity, and transport should fall under a cluster which we call the network cluster, right? The network industries in the way that I see them. And so whatever conversation you want to have around, for example, growing agriculture, if roads is not part of that conversation, right? Given the fact that we've got 86% of our cargo on roads, when the emerging market comparative is about 37% of cargo that's on roads. If rail does not come into that part of the conversation around spurring agriculture, and then we're always going to miss each other. And so I think there's a need to look at how I think we get policy coherence in the context of the economy. We can't have an IPAP, for example, that says capital first, and then you've got an NDP that talks about labor intensity, and yet you're seeing the numbers in South Africa showing a lot more capital intensity over the years, right? And we wonder why we can have jobless growth in the context of the South African economy. And so I think there are a number of things that need to happen in enabling the departments to think in a smart way. And that smart thinking will then be an important way in which we can start to truly enable, I think, more broad-based economic growth. Outside of that, I think it's going to continue being, a number of ministries peacocking around what they did, and that thing should be, the most lauded thing that they could have done for the country.
Delivery of water after 15 years, all I'm saying. Thanks, Thabi, for that. Now, the minister warned about our possible slide to Argentine status, a favorite comparison of late, and Germany of the 1920s with regards to our such situation, rising debts and the like. Thabi, I'll begin with you as our closing thing. Where are we on that historical scale from experiencing, I guess, what Germany once went through and what Argentina has been going through, I think, forever. I mean, Argentina has always been this case for me since. Just where are we on the historical scale from reaching those depths?
I think if it wasn't for the pandemic, we would be very close. I think the pandemic has allowed us to survive somewhat because the whole world is experiencing increased debt. So we're not, we don't stick out.
Yeah.
And so because we don't stick out, we don't appear too worse off. I mean, if you look at, I think there's a chart even in the supplementary budget where even Brazil is worse than us in terms of our deficit. But having said that, Brazil has demonstrated its ability to shrink their deficit and actually go into a surplus far quicker than we have. And also the composition of the Brazilian economy allows for that. They don't have the structural problems that we have. For instance, they don't have the high unemployment rate. They don't have the composition of corporate tax that Sifiso was talking about, where actually if you have big companies that would collapse, it would put a huge, it would undermine our ability to actually contribute towards taxes, especially from the corporate side. So they don't have those alarming kind of issues that we have. My worry with South Africa, and when you look at South Africa versus other emerging markets, is our ability to pay back debt. Even before the crisis, we adopted an expenditure ceiling in 2012, where we committed to cutting expenditure every year by lowering the ceiling. And even though we lowered the ceiling successfully up until recently, we actually didn't consolidate our debt as we had planned to. We actually spent more, and we spent more to accommodate state-owned entities. And we did that for political reasons. Now, if you look at all the countries that have experienced sovereign debt crisis doesn't happen overnight. And even literature will tell you that there are many signs that will tell you, that are there to tell you that you're headed towards a crisis. And everybody knows this. And there are many signs that we've had. Where it becomes very critical is where investors actually don't want anything to do with your country. And they start pulling money out, or they start demanding more buffer in terms of yields for their investments. And we are not at that level yet, in that stage, because we are in this pandemic, and we're in this pandemic along with the rest of the world. And so where money initially flowed out of emerging markets into predominantly the US and other developed markets, we're seeing money trickle back. Actually, in May, we had huge inflows into our bond market. So that also tells you that investors are still sympathetic towards South Africa. My worry, though, is that it's in the short end of the curve when you look at the bond curve. They're not looking at the long end of the curve, which implies that they're in South Africa for the next 10, 15, 20 years. They're in here for a short while because they're 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And that's the indication that they fear that this country could, in a few years' time, default. And that's why the long end of the curve is not invested as much as the short end. And we're also seeing domestic investors behave in the same way. So again, we're helped by the pandemic because we're all in this together. But as Warren Buffett said, when the tide comes out or comes in, we all know who is swimming naked. And that will, we'll see when other countries have a V or U-shaped recovery, and we are still stuck at an L shape because we are swimming naked.
Sifiso?
I mean, it's quite an interesting one. I think global markets showed signs of already not believing the South African story, and that is premised by the decoupling, or of our inflation trajectory as well as our long-term bond yields. So often, what would happen is that as your inflation trends downwards, so would your bond yields. And there was a time where they were actually decoupling and our bond yields were going up while our inflation was trending down. And therefore, it means that the market doesn't believe the numbers we put in our story. And if you remember our conversations last year, we revised our growth expectations 5 times last year, right? And therefore, when your bond yields are going up, it means investors are demanding more return, in essence, because they believe that they're taking on more risk. And that's one of the I think the interesting stories that talk to, I guess, how far down I think the risk path we are on. The fact that a lot of the foreign investors are on the short end of our yield, of our government bonds in terms of duration is also an interesting one. It's a good and a bad thing, because if they were in the long end, we could see larger spikes and larger moves in terms of flows out of the economy and the implication on currency and all of that stuff. But also it's got implications on the volatility of the currency, because on average, I think 60% of those flows don't stay longer than 18 months in the economy. And so as a result, our currency is one of the most volatile in the world, but also given the fact that it's the 16th most traded currency, right? And of those, I think it's about 84% are foreign traders on that particular currency. And so I think there's certainly an interesting value proposition that investors still see in the South African economy, given the fact that also they are buying their own government yields at negative yields, right? The government bonds at negative yields right now, right? And so this carry differential that South Africa offers them is certainly quite interesting. But I think it does hold true that can only hold insofar as the water is still inshore, and as soon as the water moves out and you appear to not have any trunks on, and then that can move quite quickly. So what does it mean? And I think for me, this is exactly the question that was burning even at the start of our conversation, is that we are not answering the question around capacity building. We're not answering we will talk to Timbuktu and back around black industrialist funds, but if our import intensity is increasing over the years, and it means that you're going to import the inputs that you want to put into your industrial process. So how does your investment and your view of your primary sector inform your industrial strategy, which will inform eventually your tertiary strategy? And so all of these things speak to a lack of cohesion in the way we understand our own policy frameworks, as well as the economic challenge that is facing us as an economy. And I think once we start to reimagine the economy from a productive capacity point of view, I make the example that we always say that entrepreneurship is a problematic thing in the country. And I say, imagine the guy who sells paper to a municipality, right? He gets the tender to sell them, a printing paper monthly. Imagine you put in your procurement process that over a 12-month period, that person's got to, get into the manufacturing space. Over a 3-year period, they got to get into forestry. And all of a sudden, you are forcing them to build capacity if they want to continue remaining in this entrepreneurship ecosystem. And this is the thinking around, sometimes not you needing to put money into the system, but to use the structures that are there to incentivize a certain kind of behavior that would see, for example, a larger percentage of medium-sized businesses coming into the marketplace. And I think that, for me, is certainly something that continues to be amiss in the way we think around the debt question, but also it has to be a function around also the capacity in the economy, because if you don't bring that part of the conversation, and then it becomes really around, a waiting game around when do we get to the end of the cliff.
Yep. All right. Thabi Leoka, independent economist, Sifiso Skenjana, chief economist, IQ Business. On what was, in truth, Namgyavuma, like I was saying, it was an uninspiring speech today from the finance minister, and just still leaving us in the dark as to just how do we get out of the hole we're in. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Thabi.